Bethel, a new Fox News poll is out today, and it includes a question asking if President Trump should be impeached and removed from office. Mark Meredith has the details.
A new Fox News poll shows nearly half of the country feels President Trump should be impeached and removed from office, but those numbers are down slightly from early October. When registered voters were asked about their thoughts on impeachment, 49% said they supported impeachment and removal from office. That number is down from 51% a few weeks ago. 4% say the House should impeach, but that the president should remain in office.
Okay, this is absolutely massive. A ferocious impeachment storm is now building on Capitol Hill after an explosive combination of courtroom revelations and Trump's own words have convinced key Democrats that the president has crossed a constitutional red line that cannot be ignored. We're talking about courts tearing into Trump's revenge prosecutions and exposing them as illegal. We're talking about Trump posting on Truth Social that Democratic lawmakers are engaging in seditious behavior, punishable by death. He literally wrote that punishable by death about sitting members of Congress. And now Representative Al Green and outside legal groups are openly urging Congress to impeach and remove Trump before Christmas. Not sometime next year, not when it's politically convenient, before Christmas. They're saying this president is threatening to execute his political opponents and that Congress has a constitutional duty to act immediately. This is not a drill. This is a sitting president of the United States suggesting that elected officials from the opposing party deserve to die, and Congress is now debating whether that finally crosses the line into impeachable conduct. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Let me walk you through what happened because the sequence of events is truly alarming. On November 20th, some Democratic lawmakers released a video reminding military service members that they have a duty to refuse illegal orders. This is basic military law. Soldiers are not supposed to follow orders that violate the Constitution or commit war crimes. It's a foundational principle that goes back to the Nuremberg trials. Democrats were concerned that Trump might try to use the military for domestic political purposes. So they made a video explaining what the law actually says about a soldier's obligation to refuse unlawful commands. It was an educational video about existing law, and Trump's response was to call it seditious behavior, punishable by death. He didn't just criticize the video. He didn't just attack the Democrats who made it. He suggested they should be executed. He amplified a supporter's call to hang them. A sitting president, using his social media platform, calling for the hanging of elected members of Congress. Al Jazeera, Reuters, and major U.S. outlets all describe this as a president flirting with executions for elected officials. That's not partisan spin. That's straightforward reporting of what Trump actually said. The legal group Free Speech for People responded immediately with a new impeachment call. On November 21st, just one day after Trump's post, they issued a statement saying a sitting president who calls for the execution of opposition lawmakers must be impeached and removed from office. They added this as a fresh article on their ImpeachTrumpAgain.org campaign, treating Trump's death threats against members of Congress as a discrete impeachable offense separate from anything else he's done. This isn't about policy disagreements or political strategy. This is about a president threatening to kill his political opponents. If that's not impeachable, what is? If a president can openly call for the execution of members of Congress without facing any constitutional consequence, then there are literally no limits on presidential conduct. The Constitution becomes meaningless as a check on executive power if this kind of rhetoric is considered acceptable. But the impeachment push isn't just about Trump's rhetoric. It's also connected to what's happening in the courts with his revenge prosecutions. A Reuters investigation published on November 25th detailed how a federal judge threw out Trump's prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James after finding that his hand-picked prosecutor was illegally appointed. The judge called these cases part of a broader retribution campaign that is now hitting serious legal barriers. So on one hand, Trump is threatening to execute political opponents on social media. On the other hand, courts are finding that his actual attempts to punish political opponents through prosecution are illegal and being thrown out. The combination of violent rhetoric and weaponized prosecution creates a pattern of authoritarian behavior that impeachment advocates say demands a congressional response. It's not just words. It's not just prosecutorial abuse. It's both together. A president who threatens violence against critics while simultaneously trying to imprison them through corrupted legal processes. Representative Al Green has vowed to file new articles of impeachment as a privileged resolution before Christmas. A privileged resolution is significant because it forces the House to act. It can't just be ignored or buried in committee. The House has to take it up within a specific time frame. Green is explicitly citing the Supreme Court's immunity ruling in his argument for why impeachment is necessary now. He says impeach, convict, and remove is the solution because the Supreme Court has granted Trump immunity from prosecution for official acts. If courts can't hold Trump accountable because of immunity, then Congress has to use the constitutional tool that exists specifically for situations where a president abuses power. Impeachment isn't just a political process, it's the constitutional remedy for presidential misconduct that can't be addressed through normal legal channels. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into exactly what Trump said, why it matters constitutionally, how the revenge prosecution collapse connects to the impeachment push, and what happens next as Congress debates whether there's any line this president can cross that will finally trigger real consequences. Let's break it down. All right, so let's get into the specifics of what Trump actually said, because the exact words matter for understanding why this is generating such an intense response. On November 20th, Trump reacted to a video where Democratic lawmakers reminded military service members of their obligation to refuse illegal orders. The video featured members of Congress explaining that soldiers have a duty under the Uniform Code of Military Justice to disobey orders that would violate the law or the Constitution. This principle has been part of military law for decades. It's why we prosecuted Nazi soldiers at Nuremberg who claimed they were just following orders. The Democrats were concerned that Trump might try to use the military in ways that exceed his constitutional authority, and they wanted service members to know that they're not obligated to follow orders that cross legal lines. It was frankly a pretty straightforward explanation of existing law. Trump's response was to post that this constituted seditious behavior, punishable by death. He used capital letters for emphasis, death. This wasn't ambiguous or subject to interpretation. He explicitly said members of Congress who reminded troops of their legal obligations were committing sedition, a serious federal crime, and that sedition is punishable by execution. He then amplified a supporter's message, calling to hang them. A sitting president of the United States used his official platform to call for hanging members of Congress. That's not metaphorical. That's not a figure of speech. That's an explicit invocation of execution for political opponents. Al Jazeera described it as Trump threatening Democrats with sedition charges. Reuters reported it as Trump saying Democrats deserve death. Le Monde characterized it as Trump suggesting lawmakers are traitors. Every major outlet that covered this story recognized what it was: a president openly discussing killing his political enemies.
This is Chief Justice of the United States.
The escort committee coming in. You see Lindsey Graham, Patrick Leahy, Dianne Feinstein, Roy Blunt, all senators, followed by the Chief Justice of the United States. There he is, John Roberts. They're walking in to the U.S. Senate to begin the formal procedure of this trial of the President of the United States. If 67 senators, 2/3 of the U.S. Senate, vote to convict, he will be removed from office.
Pursuant to Rule 4 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment and the United States Constitution.
The sedition charge Trump is throwing around is itself revealing of his authoritarian mindset. Sedition is a crime of inciting rebellion or insurrection against the government. The Democrats in that video weren't inciting rebellion. They were explaining existing military law about illegal orders. But Trump views any opposition to his authority as rebellion against the state. In his mind, the president is the state, and resistance to the president is treason. That's not how American democracy works. The president serves the Constitution, not the other way around. Members of Congress have every right, indeed, they have a duty to check presidential power when it threatens to exceed constitutional limits. Calling that sedition isn't just factually wrong, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how separated powers work in our system. Or perhaps it's not a misunderstanding at all. Perhaps it's a deliberate attempt to redefine opposition as criminal and thereby silence critics through fear. The connection to January 6th is impossible to ignore. Trump's rhetoric before that day included similar themes, calling opponents traitors, suggesting they were committing crimes against the country, directing anger at specific targets. And we saw what happened when a mob of his supporters took that rhetoric seriously. People died. The Capitol was invaded. Members of Congress had to be evacuated for their safety. Mike Pence was taken to a secure location while rioters chanted about hanging him. And according to recent court filings, Trump's response to learning Pence was in danger was so what? There's a direct line between Trump's violent rhetoric and actual political violence. When he calls for hanging members of Congress, it's not abstract. There are people who will hear that call and consider acting on it. The danger is real and immediate, and anyone who lived through January 6th knows exactly how real it can get. Free Speech for People's response captures why this particular rhetoric is different from normal political attacks. Their statement said a sitting president who calls for the execution of opposition lawmakers must be impeached and removed from office. They're not saying Trump should be censured. They're not saying voters should decide in the next election. They're saying this specific conduct, threatening to execute members of Congress, requires the constitutional remedy of removal from office. The organization has been tracking Trump's impeachable offenses for years, and they're treating this as a distinct article of impeachment separate from his other conduct. That framing matters because it focuses attention on this specific line crossing rather than relitigating everything Trump has done. The question becomes simple: is threatening to execute political opponents an impeachable offense? If the answer is no, then we've essentially decided there are no limits on what a president can say or threaten. The Reuters investigation into Trump's revenge prosecutions provides the other half of the impeachment argument that Trump isn't just talking about punishing enemies, he's actually doing it through corrupt legal processes. The investigation detailed how federal judges have thrown out Trump's prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James after finding that the prosecutor who handled those cases was illegally appointed. The judges described these cases as part of a broader retribution campaign that is hitting serious legal barriers. So we have a president who threatens violence against critics on social media and simultaneously runs an illegal prosecution operation to imprison those same critics. The rhetoric and the action work together as parts of a single authoritarian project, intimidate opponents with threats of violence while using the machinery of government to persecute them legally. Each element is bad on its own. Together, they represent a fundamental assault on democratic governance. Representative Al Green's strategy of using a privileged resolution is tactically important and worth understanding. A privileged resolution forces the House to take action. It can't simply be referred to committee and forgotten. Within a set number of legislative days, the House has to vote on whether to table the resolution or move forward with it. Even if the resolution is ultimately tabled rather than adopted, every member of Congress has to go on record about whether they think threatening to execute political opponents is acceptable presidential conduct. That recorded vote becomes part of the historical and political record. Republicans who vote to table the resolution are voting to say this is fine. A president can threaten to kill his critics and we won't do anything about it. That's a vote they'll have to defend to their constituents and to history. Green's explicit citation of the Supreme Court's immunity ruling adds constitutional weight to his impeachment argument. The court ruled earlier this year that presidents have broad immunity from prosecution for official acts. Critics of that ruling warned it would create a presidency above the law, and now we're seeing those warnings play out in real time. If Trump has immunity for official acts, and he claims that attacking political opponents is part of his official duties as president, then courts may not be able to hold him accountable, no matter how extreme his conduct becomes. Impeachment is specifically designed for exactly this situation. It exists as a constitutional remedy for presidential misconduct that can't be addressed through normal legal channels. Green is arguing that the immunity ruling makes impeachment more necessary, not less, because it's now the only remaining check on presidential abuse of power. The timing of this impeachment push before Christmas reflects an urgency that previous efforts haven't had. Green isn't talking about launching a lengthy investigation or holding months of hearings before deciding whether to proceed. He's saying the conduct is already clear, the evidence is Trump's own public statements, and Congress needs to act immediately. The death threat posts exist. Everyone can read them. There's no factual dispute about what Trump said. The only question is whether Congress will treat threatening to execute political opponents as crossing a line that requires response. Green clearly believes it does, and he's not willing to wait for some future moment that might be more politically convenient. He wants action now, while the posts are fresh and the danger they represent is immediate. The pattern of Trump's rhetoric escalating over time supports the argument that this moment requires action rather than patience. He's been calling opponents traitors and criminals for years. He's been suggesting they should face harsh punishment, but explicitly calling for their execution, using the word death, amplifying calls to hang them, represents a qualitative escalation beyond previous rhetoric. If there's no response to this escalation, the next escalation will come, and eventually the rhetoric may translate into action, either by Trump himself using the powers of government to persecute opponents, or by supporters who take his calls for violence seriously. The argument for impeachment isn't just about punishing past conduct, it's about preventing future harm by establishing that this kind of rhetoric has consequences. Okay, let's break this down into clear points so you understand exactly what's happening and why it matters so much. Point number 1, on November 20th, Trump posted on Truth Social that Democratic lawmakers who reminded troops of their duty to refuse illegal orders were engaged in seditious behavior punishable by death, and he amplified a supporter's call to hang them. This is a sitting president explicitly calling for the execution of elected members of Congress. Al Jazeera, Reuters, and major U.S. outlets all describe this as a president flirting with executions for political opponents. The posts exist. Everyone can read them. There's no ambiguity about what Trump said or what he meant by using the word death in capital letters. Point number 2, the legal group Free Speech for People, responded on November 21st with a new impeachment call, stating that a sitting president who calls for the execution of opposition lawmakers must be impeached and removed from office. They've added this as a fresh article on their ImpeachTrumpAgain.org campaign, treating the death threats against members of Congress as a distinct impeachable offense. This isn't about relitigating old controversies. It's about this specific conduct representing a clear constitutional red line that requires congressional response. Point number 3, separately, a Reuters investigation published November 25th detailed how federal judges threw out Trump's prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James after finding his hand-picked prosecutor was illegally appointed. The judges described these cases as part of a broader retribution campaign that is now hitting serious legal barriers. So Trump isn't just threatening violence against opponents, he's actively trying to imprison them through corrupted legal processes that courts are finding unlawful. The rhetoric and the prosecution operate together as parts of a single authoritarian project. Point number 4, Representative Al Green has vowed to file new articles of impeachment as a privileged resolution before Christmas, explicitly citing the Supreme Court's immunity ruling. He argues that impeach, convict, and remove is the solution because the Supreme Court has granted Trump immunity from prosecution for official acts. If courts can't hold Trump accountable because of immunity, then Congress must use the constitutional tool specifically designed for situations where presidents abuse power beyond what normal legal processes can address. Impeachment exists for exactly this situation. Point number 5, the privileged resolution mechanism. Green is using forces the House to act and puts every member on record about whether threatening to execute political opponents is acceptable presidential conduct. Even if the resolution is ultimately tabled, Republicans will have to vote to say this is fine, that a president can call for hanging members of Congress without any constitutional consequence. That vote becomes part of the historical record and part of every member's political legacy. Now let's talk about what this means for American democracy and the limits of presidential power, because this confrontation forces fundamental questions that can't be avoided. The core question is simple. Is there anything a president can say or do that crosses a line requiring congressional action? If threatening to execute members of Congress isn't that line, where is the line? If amplifying calls to hang political opponents doesn't trigger impeachment, what would? The Constitution provides impeachment as the remedy for presidential misconduct precisely because the founders understood that some conduct is so dangerous to democratic governance that it can't wait for the next election to be addressed. If we decide that death threats against lawmakers don't meet that standard, we're essentially deciding that there is no standard. The connection to January 6th makes this more than an abstract constitutional debate. We've already seen what happens when Trump's violent rhetoric meets a motivated base of supporters. The Capitol was invaded, police officers were beaten, members of Congress fled for their lives, a woman was shot and killed, and Trump watched it happen while responding. So what to reports that his vice president was in danger? That wasn't ancient history, it was less than 5 years ago. The same rhetoric that preceded that violence is now being used against current members of Congress. The same calls for punishment of traitors that fired up the January 6th mob are now directed at specific Democratic lawmakers by name. Anyone who thinks this rhetoric is harmless hasn't been paying attention to what Trump's words actually produce when his supporters decide to act on them. For Republicans, this impeachment push creates an uncomfortable situation with no good options. They can vote to table Green's resolution, which puts them on record saying death threats against members of Congress are acceptable. They can vote to proceed with impeachment, which would anger Trump's base and potentially end their political careers. Or they can try to find some middle ground, condemning Trump's rhetoric without taking constitutional action, which will satisfy no one and look like cowardice to everyone. The genius of Green's approach is that it doesn't let anyone hide. The privileged resolution forces a vote. Every Republican has to decide publicly and on the record whether this conduct is defensible. That's an uncomfortable position for members who privately find Trump's rhetoric disturbing, but are terrified of crossing him politically. For Democrats, the impeachment push is about more than just this moment. It's about establishing a record for history and creating consequences for conduct that can't be allowed to stand unchallenged. Even if impeachment doesn't result in removal, and with the Republican House and Republican Senate, it probably won't. The process itself matters. It documents what Trump said. It forces debate about whether it's acceptable. It puts members of both parties on record. It creates precedent for how Congress responds to presidential threats of violence against legislators. Future generations will look back at this moment and see either a Congress that acted to defend democratic norms or a Congress that shrugged while a president called for executing his opponents. What do we want that historical record to show? The Supreme Court immunity ruling that Green cites has changed the constitutional calculus around accountability. Before that ruling, there was at least the theoretical possibility that extreme presidential misconduct could be addressed through criminal prosecution after a president left office. The immunity ruling significantly narrowed that possibility by giving presidents broad protection for official acts. If Trump claims that attacking political opponents is part of his official duties, and he's made exactly that argument in other contexts, courts may not be able to touch him. Impeachment becomes not just one option among many, but potentially the only constitutional remedy available. Green is arguing that the court's expansion of immunity makes congressional action more urgent, not less. The immunity ruling didn't eliminate all checks on presidential power. It shifted the burden to Congress to exercise the check that remains. The timing of all this happening as courts dismantle Trump's revenge prosecutions, while Trump himself escalates his violent rhetoric, creates a perfect storm that makes the stakes impossible to ignore. It's not just that Trump is saying dangerous things. It's not just that his prosecutions are being thrown out as illegal. It's both at once, revealing a pattern of authoritarian governance that uses every tool available, legal and rhetorical, prosecutorial and threatening, to intimidate and punish political opponents. The impeachment push tries to address that pattern comprehensively rather than treating each element in isolation. The death threats and the weaponized prosecutions are connected manifestations of the same impulse to treat opposition as criminal and to make critics fear for their freedom and their lives. Here's the bottom line. Congress is facing an impeachment alert after Trump called Democratic lawmakers seditious and suggested their conduct is punishable by death, while simultaneously courts are throwing out his revenge prosecutions as illegal. Free Speech for People has issued a formal impeachment call, saying a president who threatens to execute opposition lawmakers must be removed. Representative Al Green has vowed to file articles of impeachment as a privileged resolution before Christmas, citing the Supreme Court's immunity ruling as making congressional action the only remaining check on presidential abuse of power. The death threat post exists. The illegal prosecutions have been documented. The pattern of authoritarian conduct is clear. The only question is whether Congress will act. So stay tuned, because this impeachment push forces a confrontation that the political system has been avoiding. Can a president threaten to execute his political opponents without any constitutional consequence? Can he run illegal prosecutions against critics while calling for their deaths? Can the combination of violent rhetoric and weaponized government power proceed unchecked because no one wants to take the politically difficult step of impeachment? Green's resolution will force answers to these questions. Every member of Congress will have to vote on whether this conduct is acceptable, and whatever they decide, that vote becomes part of the historical record, part of how this era is remembered and judged by future generations. This is what it looks like when democratic institutions face their ultimate test, when they have to decide whether the constitutional tools designed to check presidential abuse of power will actually be used, or whether those tools will gather dust while the president openly threatens to kill the people who are supposed to hold him accountable. The next few weeks will tell us a lot about whether American democracy still has the capacity to defend itself. Pay attention, because this is one of those moments where history is being written in real time and the outcome matters for everyone.